Yes. Tadier.
So if nobody else wants to speak at the moment, it may be helpful for me to guide members through my thinking and my levels of opposition to the amendment. So just to clarify, because I wasn't able to move it partially amended, I'm happy with Part A of the amendment. In Part B, I would probably start off by saying I'm not fully opposing Part B. I think there is some value that is added in the wording of Part B in terms, in particular, the reference to provision of humanitarian assistance. If I was being particularly robust in my opposition, I would say that we don't really need the new wording for Part B, because I think humanitarian assistance is trying to get into Gaza in particular all the time, and there are difficulties around that, we know. And we also know that a ceasefire or a suspension in hostilities, whichever you want to call it and whichever comes first, will presumably only help that humanitarian aid to get to its destination. So in a sense, I don't think it's necessary, but I think it's important to signal that intent. The other thing to point out is that I know members will be reading it and say, well, actually, it's pretty much the same wording, but Deputy Gorsters just seems to have rejigged certain parts of it and put it in a different order. And I think he has spoken to that. He's talked to the fact that he thinks certain things need to happen in a certain order and that we shouldn't presuppose these things just materialising automatically. Although I note that there's nothing automatic in his wording that would necessarily suggest that there needs to be a particular order. So if I'm being targeted with my words, I think it's more, I wouldn't waste a lot of energy on my part in opposing Part B. I would say that I think my wording is still better, but if members are inclined to vote for Part B, I think there's some merit in that as well. But that isn't the case for the other amendments. So whilst A and B, I think I won't lose any sleep over B, I think that the other parts are there for a particular reason. I do want to focus now, I think, on a more serious matter, because I think it's not exactly the best reference, but I remember Einstein's got a famous quote about making things as simple as possible, but no simpler. And I think in these kind of propositions, it's important to get as much consensus as possible, but without it becoming a completely meaningless proposition. And I have to say, when we get an argument put forward, and I'm looking at axiomatic arguments here rather than necessarily material ones, is that when you say that a certain thing is a red line for a certain group, therefore I can't put that in, it's not a reasonable rationale to follow, because you need to know why it's a red line for that particular group, and why, in fact, when it's a proven fact and a proven set of wording that is being used in the international community, just because one group purports for all its members to have an issue with a certain wording, I think that's highly problematic. And it raises the question then, of course, what happens if there are two red lines for two separate groups which are mutually exclusive? What if one group that you're talking to says, actually, it's a red line for us that you include this in your proposition, because it is a red line for some members of the community that this wording is included, and that's why it's been included in there. And the point is, it hasn't been included arbitrarily, it's been included for a reason. So let's look at the wording, so we're not just talking in the abstract all the time. We're talking about the potential for genocide, which is being removed from a proposition, and I think that has to be strange unless there's a very good reason for it, because as I said at the beginning, I presume this assembly wants the situation and the players in that part of the world to adhere to international law and to avoid potential acts of genocide. And similarly, we want the UK not to stand by whilst one of its allies is maybe committing genocide. Not because it's an abstract concept, but because the International Court of Justice have used exactly that form of words. The International Court of Justice, which is made up of 17 judges, the vast majority of whom, I think 15, 16 of them, have agreed to this. Are we better than the International Court of Justice? Are we more impartial than the International Court of Justice when it comes to deciding whether plausible acts of genocide are taking place now in a region around the world where we know 30,000 people and counting are being, yes, killed, but many more thousands injured and losing their homes. It's not for us to say whether a genocide is happening, but it's definitely not for us to actually just recoil because the word itself is so terrible that we can't utter its name. I suspect that actually going through a possible genocide is much worse than the actual words potential genocide. And I don't know what we're going to call it. That's why I was quite passionate when I heard that Deputy Gorse was moving this amendment. Is that okay? I thought, do I put a second amendment in? What do we want to call it? If it's not a genocide, if it's not a potential genocide, is it a mass killing? Because that's the suggestion that came forward when I was actually drafting this. I had a well-intentioned email which said, are you sure you want to use the word potential genocide? In fact, I did change it. I made sure it was potential acts of genocide, because genocide can mean lots of things. It can mean not just killing people, it can mean bombing their culture, getting them out of an area so that they can't return, meaning that they can't deliver their children, that they won't be able to, that their culture is being destroyed. And I know that there is also that potential for genocide to occur on both sides, because we have heard that there is a desire, and this happens when you have hatred dominating the discourse. You get countries and you get factions which say, we want to destroy that country and we want to destroy that people. And we've heard those comments being made on both sides. So I think we shouldn't overly sanitize a debate about a very serious issue that is taking place right now, simply because some people in our community don't like the words potential for genocide. I think that's where we have to draw the line. And I'll quote what somebody said on the other side of the debate, because Deputy Gorst and his officers were kind enough to send me, with the person's consent, some correspondence. So this is somebody actually speaking from the Muslim point of view, and he qualifies that by saying, by the way, I can't speak for all Muslims, this is just my own personal opinion. So he says, one further comment is that recognizing the potential for genocide is, I believe, very important for us to acknowledge. The proposition did not accuse Israel of conducting genocide, although many independent genocide experts and in the Court of Justice believe that there is a case to answer in this regard. The proposition asks that potential acts of genocide are avoided, which is entirely consistent with the ICJ ruling. So that's the part C taken care of, I hope. I leave that with members' conscience. You know, I'm not going to take any of this personally, but I think it's a matter which we shouldn't shy away from just because we find some of this emotive. And then I come on to part D, because I think this is where what I would call, there's a lot of messing around going on, because we've got something very clear in front of us, is that there was a ruling in January from the International Court of Justice, and it was a very long ruling, but it was also very clear. And on the one hand, it didn't tell Israel to stop what they were doing. It recognized that there is a conflict going on and that they have rights around that to address and to defend themselves. But they did say, actually, they needed to change the way that they were fighting, which is exactly what was said at the beginning by the Americans, which said, you know, it does matter how Israel defends itself. So again, that theme was consistent, and it's saying, actually, you do need to change the way you're fighting, and you need to make sure that potential acts of genocide are avoided, and that's the way you need to continue to fight if you are going to continue fighting. So to remove any reference to the South Africa case, I just think is complete madness, because there is a tangible ruling that's been there, and to simply say that the independence and work of the International Court of Justice, including in relation to the conflict in Gaza, should be respected, but having particular regard to the interim ruling is the classic example of watering down something that doesn't need to be watered down, I think, just for the sake of it. So I would urge members to reject Part D on that basis. Part E, I'm very pleased that Deputy Gorst has listened to members. I think that whatever our individual thoughts, if we have any, about what the potential solution might be in that area, it's not our place as an assembly, I don't think, to say that the solution must definitely be a two-state solution. I think it's worth addressing that quickly. We had a very helpful, I think, presentation yesterday. I won't go into any too much detail because it was a private briefing, I think, for States members. But it was useful in the sense that we got some of the scope of different views, even within the pro-Israel camp, if you like. So we had the first address from somebody who is of Arab origin, who lives in the area and says that actually Israel, he joined the Israeli army, even though he's not an Israeli, even though he's not Jewish, he is an Israeli, because he sees Israel as being for everyone. There are Palestinians living there, there are Christians, and there are Jews, and there are secular people, and there are religious people who live there. So it wasn't anything weird for him to join the Israeli army. On the other hand, so for somebody like that, you might think that actually he's already living in a one-state solution. He sees a vision where it's possible for Jews and Arabs and Christians and people who are of no particular creed or faith or who can live together. That might well mean that there's ultimately a one-state solution, and I think there's definitely some merit to that, where all human rights are treated equally and everyone's human rights are respected equally as well. But the Deputy Gorst is right. It's not our place to say then that a two-state solution should be superior to another one. Ultimately, whichever solution provides the most peace and stability is the one to be pursued. So, on the one hand, I do welcome the suggestion that there, of course, needs to be a solution which looks at justice, freedom from occupation, and peace for Palestinians. But it comes at the removal of the reference to the occupation of the Palestinian territories and the fact that we do have occupied Palestinian territories. And I've circulated information to members, and I'm surprised that Deputy Gorst talks about this being contested. I mean, there will always be things that are contested by people who have a particular vision about how things should be. But the international community consensus on the occupied territories is exactly that. They call them the occupied Palestinian territories for a reason. And I think this is where it gets down to the important parts, is that if there is to be any solution, there has to be compromise that is forthcoming. So whilst there will be some who simply point to one side and say, if they release the hostages, then the war will be over, you can imagine another side saying, well, if they leave our occupied territories, then we will release the hostages and then the war will be over. So I'm simply saying that we need to recognise that there are demands on both sides that need to be met and that are asking to be met. And again, that we shouldn't simply shy away from what the international consensus is on those issues. I will leave members to consider that, because I know members will have their own thoughts and will have done their own reading around that. But I do come to part F, and I think this is fundamental. So I think if we can't agree on anything else during this debate, and I think we have already agreed on quite a lot, it's surely got to be part F, because this comes back to the autonomy, not of the island against the UK, but the autonomy of the Assembly with regard to our own ministers. Part F is just standard wording in my original proposition, and there's absolutely no need for this to be amended. When Deputy Southern moved his proposition back in 2003, asking the then Assembly to have to condemn the UK's government position, or to say that we didn't want any part of that in what was, it turned out, to be an illegal invasion of Iraq. Deputy Southern was right when the legal advice was received. And the States Assembly, in its wisdom, even though it wasn't a majority, it wasn't unanimous, said that no, we don't want the UK to invade Iraq. But he asked the bailiff to convey that message there, because, of course, it was the decision of the Assembly. And it may well be that we could have asked the bailiff to convey this message to the UK government, whatever message it is that we decide we want to have today. But of course, we're under a ministerial system, so it's probably quite right that it should be the government of Jersey and probably the External Relations Minister, if not the Chief Minister who conveys that message to the UK government. So part F in the original wording says, request the government of Jersey, or the minister, he's part of the government of Jersey, to express the views of the Assembly on this matter to the UK government. Quite straightforward, because I think he talks to the UK government quite a lot anyway, so he can probably just tell them when he's over there next, oh, by the way, we've had this decision. I think it would be a bit more formal than that, actually, but he's got access to them. And not to have this very strange wording, which is to request that the government of Jersey updates the Assembly over the steps taken by ministers in the passive voice, taken by ministers to raise this matter with the UK government. Of course, there may not be any steps, because it depends what the government wants to do. And it could be actually, yeah, we haven't taken any steps because we didn't think it was appropriate. And in fact, that's been the theme from the minister anyway. He says, I don't think we should have had this debate anyway. I mean, the comments say that this could have been dealt with by an in-committee debate. That's not true. We couldn't have had an in-committee debate and then come to a decision about what the next course of action is. So we are making a decision one way or the other today. We are making a decision either to adopt some of these amendments, all of the amendments, none of the amendments, hopefully at least part A. And then once we've made that decision, please go away, Minister, and tell the UK government that we've made this decision. That's I think the simplest, lowest hanging fruit that we should all be able to agree on as an Assembly. And if we can't do that, and I look to ministers even to uphold that basis of democracy, is to say that, please just go away and say that it's the Assembly that's made this decision. It's not necessarily a government's position. It may be a partial government position, but that's not important because we have our own Assembly in Jersey. They have debated this issue. There has been a petition in public on this issue, and the Assembly has spoken.
Thank you. Does any other member speak on the amendment?